Good evening and welcome back to World Talks. Ukraine and US talks are taking place behind closed doors in Saudi Arabian capital, Riyadh. The meeting comes just ahead of key US-Russia talks scheduled for Monday. The question is, will diplomacy make a breakthrough or hit another dead end? To discuss, I have Andreas Umland, analyst, Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies, joining me right now. Good evening, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me again.
So basically, two key issues on the agenda, right? Protecting key infrastructure and then the safety of shipping in the Black Sea. Do you think that this is viable, that they will reach these goals?
Perhaps these are obviously goals that are in Russia's interest because concerning energy infrastructure, the last attacks of Ukraine have been more successful than Russian attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And the same goes for the Black Sea, where actually the Russian Marine is not any longer present. And now apparently Russia wants to have some sort of regulation to protect its own ships from Ukrainian drones. So this is going to be a difficult negotiation for the Ukrainian delegation, especially in light of the statements by Mr. Witkoff he made a few days before.
Can you elaborate on that? Can you talk about these statements, if you could?
Well, the Witkoff is a negotiator in this matter, and he has been basically pronouncing the Russian propaganda narrative for justifying the annexation. That there are Russian speakers living in the occupied territories, and that there were referenda, and that was allegedly in their interest. And this contradicts the opinion polls that we have from this region. It also contradicts, let's say, the pictures that we got when Kherson was liberated and
right, I mean, we all know that these referendums were fraudulent, right? However, yes. What makes the current Trump administration buy into this Russian narrative?
That's a mystery to me, frankly, because this goes very far. I mean, one can sort of understand some of these arguments and explain them by simply the US not being interested in that much. But taking over these justifications for annexation and occupation is dangerous because these are the usual explanations one hears or we've heard in world history for wars, for genocide, for expansionism, and for annexation. And if that is now legitimate to just come up with some narrative and then do as grave violations of international law as Russia did in Ukraine, that is a very dangerous road to go, not just for Eastern Europe, but for the entire world.
And Bloomberg reported that sort of the US administration is saying that they would like to reach some form of a ceasefire by Easter. And of course, this is a pretty steep deadline. Do you think that they will manage to achieve that? And what if not? I mean, is trust in the United States on the line?
That's going to be a challenge. I think a full ceasefire is now in Ukraine's interest, as far as I've understood Zelensky's statements. These sort of strange partial selective ceasefires for particular objects or particular regions like the Black Sea, they look very odd to me, because that is just, they have a certain operational meaning then for the war, but they don't end the war. So a full ceasefire, I think, will be very difficult to reach because Russia has put up these conditions for a ceasefire, while Ukraine has declared that it is ready for an unconditional ceasefire. Let's see what comes out of it. I think without real pressure from the US, Putin will not agree to a meaningful ceasefire.
And what kind of leverage does the US have over Russia?
Well, potentially it does have leverage. It can impose additional sanctions, and above all, it can give Ukraine additional weaponry and ammunition and technology and intelligence data. And if you then have pressure from the Ukrainian side on the Russian front line, then I think the negotiations will make place, because then Putin will be motivated to actually talk. Now, currently, the situation is such that Russia is actually gaining not much, but every day a little territory, and so currently there's no motivation for Putin to make any compromises.
So let me turn to Europe for a moment. What's European role in all of this?
Well, Europe's role is now rising rapidly if what now is being told by the Trump administration then will also materialize, namely that Trump will withdraw basically from supporting Ukraine, and perhaps even withdraw from the US from the sort of responsibility that the US had earlier taken for European security. And then Europe will look very differently. Arguably, it does already look differently. It's so far not yet entirely clear how far these rhetorical announcements then will actually translate into material action. So Europe is now really changing rapidly, I would say by the week, and it will eventually the European Union will also become a defense union.
And do you think that the EU could potentially replace what the US is doing in terms of military provisions?
Yes, this is, I think, possible. I mean, the EU is large, and it's not only the EU. There are also countries like Canada, Great Britain, Norway, and even Asian countries like Japan and South Korea have been, or Australia have been supporting Ukraine. So there is potentially a very large coalition. I think the main problem is a sort of transition period, because there are certain technologies and there's certain data, intelligence data, that apparently cannot be as easily provided and as quickly provided by the European partners of Ukraine. And for me, that is the crucial issue. Will there be still certain equipment, certain weapons coming from the US, and also intelligence data coming from the US, until basically Europe is ready to replace the US as a deliverer, well, as an exporter of weaponry, and also as a source of intelligence data.
Mm-hmm. Well, apparently China said that they're possibly willing to be a part of a peacekeeping force once the ceasefire is introduced in Ukraine. Do you think that this is genuine, or is it just a ploy?
No, I think China would probably do that. I mean, these peacekeepers have actually a very ambivalent meaning. I think what Ukraine needs is protection from Russia, but the peacekeeping idea originally comes from international forces that protect international law. But if we then have peacekeepers at the current front line, which would then become the contact line, then oddly, peacekeepers would then sort of help Ukraine to violate international law by sort of fixating this this illegitimate contact line. So no, I think China would probably do that because they want to be part of this. They understand that this is an important battlefield, not just in Europe, but for the whole world. But these peacekeepers, I want to see first what is actually their function. If they eventually end up making this current front line into a new border, that would be dangerous, I think.
Mm-hmm. And let me go back to the European Union. A few days ago, on March 19th, the European Commission presented white paper for European defense. And do you think that I mean, provisions there are quite significant, right? A significant amounts of money. So what is the timeline of implementing that, and do you think that this will work?
Well, that's the crucial question, as I indicated already for Ukraine. Also, these timelines. It's the potential of the EU is large. I mean, it's a large economy, lots of people, well developed, lots of potential, but it has relied. The EU has relied on concerning its security on the US, which is also something that the US has been sort of offering Europe. So sometimes it's now presented, especially in the US, as a sort of rip-off of the United States. But that is a role that the United States themselves have taken, and now this is changing. And indeed, how quick that will then happen, I'm not that much of an expert on these industries or technologies, but it obviously has to happen as soon as possible if the US withdraws from its security guarantees for Europe and its support for Ukraine.
And what key projects should Europe be aiming for? Of course, we have the East Shield. What else would be significant here?
I think the most urgent question is, of course, the support for Ukraine, because that is where the weaponry and the ammunition and the intelligence data is now needed. And Russia, at the end of the day, is also the only real threat for Europe. So obviously there are other adversarial states around the world, like North Korea or Iran or perhaps even China, but these are countries far away from Europe. So whatever Ukraine can achieve in its war against Russia will be also beneficial for the rest of Europe. So that is the obvious priority for me now. Although many countries, of course, think in more introverted ways. They think about their own security, not fully understanding that their own security very much depends on the outcome of the Russian-Ukrainian war.
Mm-hmm. And going back to Mr. Witkoff, Trump's personal envoy to Vladimir Putin, in addition to being the Middle East envoy, he said that he believes, of course, that Putin does not want all of Europe. So do you think that these kinds of statements, of course, are quite disturbing? But what would need to happen for the US to change this narrative?
Well, I would perhaps agree with Witkoff that maybe Putin only wants half of Europe, not the whole of Europe. I mean, Putin was himself part of the Soviet occupation regime in Germany. He served for 5 years in Dresden in East Germany. So obviously that is his sort of framework in which he thinks. And yes, Putin says that he wants peace and is, of course, has no ambition. But that is what we usually hear from such politicians. And that's what we heard for 25 years now from Putin, that he has no ambitions with regard to Crimea or with annexing mainland Ukrainian territories, and eventually he did. So there's very little trust in what Putin says. And the problem here is not so much whether Russia wants to march through Europe, but the problem are rather countries like Poland, like Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, which are members of NATO, and the US, according to the still valid Washington Treaty, would be obliged to then respond to possible actions of Russia there, and that is the real issue. So this whole rhetoric that Russia wants to march to Portugal or something like that is actually a distraction from the real issues that are in Eastern Europe, and that will draw all the Western countries then into a war, and which could then turn into World War III.
Andreas Umland, analyst, Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. Thank you, sir, for being with us this evening. Much appreciated. And thank you for watching World Talks. Please stay tuned for more here on TVP World.